Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I am Natasha Southwell. I work in the English Partnerships team at the British Council, and I'm also the MC for today's program. The British Council welcomes you to the launch of the English Impact Report, a fresh analysis of the English ASER data, published by the British Council India and Pratham ASER Centre. Thank you for coming. We are webcasting the event, and in order to reach out to larger audiences, we hope to use social media. I would encourage all of you to tweet to the extent possible using the Twitter handle InBritish and hashtag ENGImpact. But at the same time, please do keep your phones on silent. Thank you. We are also filming this event and taking photographs. If anyone in the audience has an objection to the photos being taken and used for non-commercial purposes by the British Council and our partners, please let me or my colleagues know, and we'll make sure that we do not use any photograph or footage that features you. Please may I now invite Rob Lyons, Director, British Council India, to come on the stage and say a few words in welcome.
Thank you very much, Natasha, and ladies and gentlemen, a very good evening to all of you, and a welcome also to those who are watching live on the webcast. And I think we have colleagues gathered in our British Council centres in Chandigarh, Calcutta, Bangalore and Hyderabad, so welcome to all of you as well. Tonight we are here to celebrate the launch of the English Impact Report on India in partnership with Pratham ASER. And this includes critical inputs from the Centre of Literacy and Multilingualism, the University of Reading, and the English and Foreign Languages University in Hyderabad. And our partnership with Pratham is one of the most innovative that we have in English. And it's a partnership that is of both strategic benefit to both partners. But as the Association of EFL and Reading Universities indicate, there is scope for other organisations to come on board and strengthen this partnership. And we very much welcome this and would very much support it. There is an old Chinese saying which says that we run faster alone, but we go a lot further if we walk with friends. And this is certainly the case with our relationship with Pratham, Reading and EFL Hyderabad. The report is a direct and tangible result of our organisations getting to know each other better over a sustained period of time, and underscores the importance of English as a language of opportunity, access, education and social equity, but not at the cost of the sustained health of local vernaculars and the national language, Hindi. Above all, this report has both strengthened and underlined the Chinese proverb I quoted earlier. Reflecting back to 2009, I think we have travelled much further together than we set out to back then. But drawing on each other's strengths, we have achieved many milestones and touched upon more lives than we could hope to do on our own. And I am certain that this journey will continue to gather in both strength and gather pace in the future. So welcome all again. We are delighted that we've got with us our Deputy Chair, Baroness Usha Prasher, who's visiting India for the first time in her current role. And we also have with us our Chief Executive of the British Council, Mr. Martin Davidson. I would now like to invite Martin to say a few words. Thank you very much.
Rob, thank you very much indeed. Ladies and gentlemen, could I start by saying what a great pleasure it is to be again here in India. And every time that I come to India, I think I'm struck more than anything else by how multilingual this country truly is. Almost everyone I've met in India is multilingual. Almost all of them switch effortlessly, whether it's between English and Hindi, or English and Tamil, or Hindi and Gujarati, or Marathi and Bengali. The way in which, as a country, you are able to use language is something which I think we in Britain should admire and be slightly jealous of. And I'll come back to that in a minute. We know that India is one of the world's most linguistically diverse countries in the world. The recent findings of the People's Linguistic Survey of India, a community-based effort led by Ganesh Devi, says that there are 780 living languages in India, and India is home to 3 of the 10 most widely spoken languages in the world: Bengali at number 7, Hindi at number 5, and English at number 3. And of course, English is an Indian language, just as much as it is a language of the UK or of Australia or of America. The German philosopher Nietzsche said, "We live in a prison house of language." And indeed, language is one of the defining features of our species. Languages are central in giving us our identity, in defining and limiting the range of our thinking, as well as our relationships, professional and personal. Language articulates our culture. It provides context for our ways of thinking. It provides access to what we regard as important in our lives. And if we are monolingual, our lives are more limited. We're cut off from the thinking of others. We're cut off from ways of life of others. It limits our understanding of how other people might be thinking and how they might look at us as individuals. And for us in the UK, certainly in my view, one of the greatest problems we have is that we are increasingly a monolingual country. We, this week, have launched, as part of the UK's International Languages Week, a number of surveys, but one shows that 75% of adults in the UK do not have a second language. And the needs of business, of trade, of diplomacy, of security, but above all, of cultural exchange, are limited because we are unable to engage with other people in their own way of thinking. Instead, we ask them to talk to us in our way of thinking. And it's not just a question of our language, it's the way and the modes of thought which language actually convey, which I think limits the exchange that we can have as a result. And we also need to recognize that learning a language in addition to our mother tongue also implies choice. It implies aspiration and status, aspirations for the future of ourselves and our families, which we would be extremely unwise to ignore. And this was within the British Council's broad remit of international cultural relations. Very often people look at us and think we're an organisation which is all about promoting English. We're not. We're an organisation which is about promoting international friendship, connections, trust and relationships. And of course we want other people to develop a wider knowledge of our own language. It's important. But also it's important that we promote in the UK the wider understanding of other people's languages. We support English as a language in addition to the languages spoken by individuals, not instead. It is English in the context of multilingualism that we believe is important, not English as a dominant language. Now, we all know that higher education and high quality education is essential for any nation wishing to build a knowledge economy, encourage international trade, improve public health, increase equity, all those other issues which a broad education it makes possible within a country. And we know also that India has made vast strides in the availability and take-up of school places. But also many studies have shown that the learning results still remain something to be worked on. And India's Planning Commission acknowledges this, and as a result there's a very sharp focus in improving the quality of learning outcomes at all stages of education in the 12th plan. Good learning outcomes are the result of a number of factors. They include the obvious: good physical and emotional condition of the children, an appropriate curriculum, well-trained teachers, good pedagogical approach, good teaching, the correct physical context and resources, especially books. And that applies across the board, whether that is early childhood education or university or adult education. And the jobs of ministries of education and other education authorities is to create policies that improve learning outcomes. But policymakers also have to listen to people. In the case of education, that means listening more than anything else to parents. And that was one of the core issues which we were discussing in South Africa last month at the Learning and Development Conference. And we were looking at, well, what does that mean to listen to parents? We in the British Council are often asked, how can I get my child to learn English How can I give my child better English than I have? Because parents see English as a language of opportunity, either because it is one of the national languages, or because it is a language of administration, or more likely because it is the language of business and trade. It is frequently seen as a key to a better life, getting a good job, moving out of poverty, aspiring to a better way of life for yourself, your family, and also for your society. And it's seen that way because indeed that is what it offers people. It is often seen as a way of changing the fortunes of whole families, but also a route through which you get genuine international opportunity, being part of a global world, not part of a local world. One reason is that English has indeed emerged as one of the 21st century schools that can lift children and families from the local, even from the national, into the international community. We know, for example, that in parts of Africa, those who have access to English are 30% more likely to get a job, and if they get that job, then 50%, they are likely to earn 50% more in lifetime earnings than those who do not. So parents are not wrong. English is a critical skill which children need. And parents often see their society's elite getting high quality education, usually a private education, and in the English medium. And so they ask a very simple question. Well, if it's good enough for you, why is it not good enough for me? And I think that's a question which we collectively have to find an answer to. Policymakers must listen to the parents, but listen to what the parents really want, not what they say they want. What the parent wants is a high quality education for their child, a curriculum that is appropriate to a modern global society. And we believe that that ideal curriculum is highly likely to include English as a component, but it is not the only component. It is part, not even necessarily the most important part. All too often, if we don't listen to the parent will go and do what they want to do anyway, and that leads to poor quality and often high-cost education choices. But we also know that if a child is educated in their home language, certainly in the early years and through into the middle stages of their basic education, they're going to have better education outcomes. If the child is able to learn English as a subject rather than to learn in English, then it is likely that they're going to have better outcomes. And very much for us as an organisation, that is a set of beliefs which informs much of the work that we do. Certainly, we want to support the education of people, the ability of people to learn English. We don't necessarily want to support education in English, where that is not in the best education interests of the child or indeed of the society. And I very much hope and very much welcome this publication. I very much hope it will be a contribution, an important contribution to this debate. Where does language fit within the wider curriculum? How do we make sure the best learning outcomes for our children? How do we ensure that our children have access to the skill set that they undoubtedly will need for this complex, globalized, challenging and competitive world into which we are introducing them? But also one where the benefits of being part of that international community are extraordinarily high, and where we know that if we give them the skills to be able to take part in that, then the opportunities will grow and grow. I look forward to a very high quality debate, which I know we're going to hear this evening, but also that this is part of a wider debate about the role of language in education and ensuring the best outcomes for our children. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, Martin. Please may I now invite Dr. Madoff Shovin, CEO, Pratham Education Foundation, to come on stage and say a few words.
Ladies and gentlemen, I'm quite aware that I'm here for a ceremonial purpose and not to express my opinions about English or English teaching or learning outcomes. I'm actually sitting there and watching the logos of British Council and Pratham and ASER together. Was really funny. It hadn't hit me that these logos could actually be put together on one, whatever you call it, display. We see ourselves as street people. We're street fighters working on the ground, and to see that a collaboration between British Council and Pratham has actually happened over the years it's being acknowledged, is a matter of great honor, I think, to me personally and to my organization. So thank you for this collaboration and for acknowledging it. Yeah. Street people occasionally like to go to the palaces as well. I say street people because we've always had different opinions than what the education establishment in India or globally held. For example, Rukmini's efforts in ASER since 2005 actually brought out the evidence that while there can be schooling, it doesn't necessarily translate into learning, and which has affected the global discourse as we go towards the next Millennium Development Goals. And we're very happy that everybody's talking more and more about the learning outcomes, including your question here or over there. Since I've been told that my role is, well, I have not been told, but I'm quite aware that it is a very ceremonial presence. So I've been thinking, I must, as a ceremonial person, I should say something clever. Something to think about. This morning I was looking at some data from North Indian villages and villages in Maharashtra and slums in urban Maharashtra and northern Indian Maharashtra. And I saw things that sooner or later we'll organize a better survey and understand. But what occurred to me was the young people of India know, and this is the clever part, know much more English than they think they do, but they know much less English than what the system expects them to know. I think there is something to figure out as to what is learning English. What are you expecting them to learn? What kind of English? Are they going to write the legalese or the bureaucratic language? Is that what you want them to understand? Technical subjects, or should they be able to get by? So what is it that we mean by learning English? Is learning English something for everybody, the same? Or should it be, or could it be different? Or is it not? Maybe the learning process is uniform, but the certification process could be different. Could you certify me for the number of English words I know? I may not know the grammar of it, and who cares? On the Twitter, you don't really need grammar, right? So anyways, so those are the little few clever remarks that I wanted to make, something for us all to think about. If you want to take it home, be my guest. So thank you again for this collaboration. And let me remind you that we are street people, not easy to deal with. We always have our maverick views. Thank you for inviting me and my team here. Thank you. I knew I had to be here. Okay.
Thank you, Dr. Shovin. Now may I request Martin Davidson and Rob Lyons to come on stage once again to launch the English Impact Report. Please may I invite Dr. Rukmini Banerji, Director, Pratham ASER Center, and Dr. Vivien Perry, Senior Researcher, English Language Assessment, English and Exams, British Council, on stage to present the report findings.
Thank you so much for inviting us here. This is the first time that our data has been taken on by universities and by an institution like British Council. And Vivien will present, of course, a deeper analysis. What I thought I'd do is just give you a quick view of what this is all about. We hope all of you know what ASER is, but just in case you don't, there is a quick 2-minute tutorial to ASER. We started doing ASER in 2005. There was a whole number of reasons as to why this was an important thing to do at the time. And we've done it ever since for the last, this is the 9th year. One of the reasons is, as Madhav said, that we have enrollment levels which are very high. And perhaps it was time for us all to think about, if you have more than 95% children going to school, it's perhaps time to look at what are they doing in school. But there was a host of other reasons as well. We had a new education cess, we had a new government at the time. There was a lot of talk about outlays to outcomes, and it seemed for a variety of reasons. We also had been working with children for a long time, and we knew that if you actually acknowledged that there is a learning problem, a lot could be done about it. So I won't bore you with the story of how ASER came to be, but just a quick round of what ASER is. So we do this every year. It's done in every rural district in India. We have close to 600 districts, and therefore ASER is done in every district, practically every district. In every district, a local organization does it. So this has now linkages to more than 500 partners across the country. If you multiply that by 9, some people have done it over and over again, but you reach a very large number of organizations in every district. And we have to think, as we move ahead, what do we do with those partnerships as well? So just because of the sheer size of the exercise, in every district, anywhere between 25 to 60 people may be involved. And we estimate that something like 25 to 30,000 people every year are actually involved in the doing of ASER. We look at kids from the age of 3 to 16. We do not ask small children to read or to do arithmetic, but we start that with sort of children of primary school age. And so the assessments are done really with the age group of 5 to 16. We do it in the household, and I'm very happy that today Vivien and Jamie were able to go out, not to a village because it would take a little time to go from Delhi, but they were able to go to some communities in Delhi and actually have the experience of doing ASER. And that makes us very happy, because while data is good and we have a lot of data, we felt it was important that the actual experience of doing ASER is felt by the researchers. So last year we don't do English every year, we do your local language and math every year, but we've done English 3 years, and last year I think close to about 500,000 kids were actually assessed with the ASER tool. Now this is the tool. It's like the simplest English tool perhaps one could think of. And each of these tasks or items have quite a long history. We had, I think, a whole day conversation, my colleague Wilma is here, on capital letters and small letters, and are they the same or are they different, and should they be done or should they not be done. And many people were consulted, and this is what we came up with. We then asked kids to read these simple words. And I have to say that, among the many difficult things that we've done in ASER, this coming up with a list of simple words in English, which also have an everyday, relevance, and are simple words in your own local language, all the way from Nagaland till Kerala, was perhaps one of the hardest things that we've ever done. So children have to read this very simple word, and then we ask them to read the sentences. And depending on the level at which they can comfortably read, we then ask them the meaning. So if you are able to read words, we then ask you, what does this word mean in your own language? And then we do the same with the sentence. So this is basically 500,000 kids are tested on this tool, which seems and is a very, very simple basic tool. Very quick view of what ASER last year told us. And what I've done is I've just put a few of grades here, and you've seen the tool. And you can see that by 8th standard, by which time you're at the end of your elementary stage, about half the children can read the sentences fluently. They can probably do much, much more. ASER is a floor test, so I can tell you what they can do and below, but they can probably do much more as well. but at least half the children in 8th standard in India can read English sentences and do more. But that also means that the other half need some help to get there. And so we feel that this kind of an exercise actually should be informing what we try to teach our kids and how we try to teach them, and how we, in fact, we enable our teachers to enable kids to get to where we would like them to get. Because we are very concerned with reading in your own language, we can see that there must be a link, and I think Vivien will tell us a lot more about the links between children's ability to do English and others. But ASER provides an opportunity to actually explore these. And we have to remember that for many children, the language, the regional language, or the language of instruction is perhaps not their first language either. So I know in the language world, people use L1 and L2. I'm sure you can say L3, L4, L15 as you go along. But we at least have 2 languages, and 1 year in ASER we also looked at the home language that they use. And so this kind of language data, very basic but very large, is available in ASER, and we hope that more people will use it. Just the final word is that the ASER model has been used in India, as you know, for almost a decade now, and people from different countries were curious about what this is. So we now have very similar initiatives going on in Pakistan, in East Africa, in 3 countries in East Africa, as well as in West Africa, and increasing interest in this kind of ordinary people going out with very simple instruments and trying to understand where their children are. And we have, looking at this partnership with British Council, we are hoping that not just the India ASER and the English, but similar ones from Pakistan and East Africa, if the data is easily available and for you, not too much, that this report be a first in a series of many more of these explorations of language for children that can be done. Thank you.
Good evening. I would like to start by, on behalf of my colleague Jamie Dunlea and myself, thanking Pratham ASER for inviting us here to take part in this report launch. And I would particularly like to thank them for organising what Rukmini has just told you about, which was the field visit that we had this morning. When I was editing this report, it was very interesting and I learnt an awful lot, but it was very abstract because I had never been to India before and I really didn't understand the context. Since this morning, I have had an absolute awakening, eye-opening, whatever you like to call it, but it actually has been concretized, and I now understand what I have edited. So, having said that, let me tell you more. Looking back and looking forward, an overview of the main findings is in fact the title of the chapter that was written by Professor Barrett O'Sullivan, who fortunately couldn't be here with us tonight, because if he had been, I wouldn't be, and I would be sad. But Barry is very sorry that he's not here as well. The rationale for this study, we came to this study, we approached it as outsiders, very much as people who had no knowledge of the local context or of the situation. So it was designed as a pilot study intended to provide information and suggestions. It in no way attempts to provide answers to policy questions. That is actually not our business, but it is not our intention either. So it should be seen as complementing the existing ASER reports and possibly offering a fresh perspective on the analysis of the data and just give you things to think about as to what might be done with this vast mountain of data that exists. The research questions that were formulated are there any trends in L2 reading, second language reading performance in primary school across the different years of the survey? Now, although the studies collect data on children from what do you call it? It's not year 5, standard, sorry. Standard 1 to standard 10, that's so much data it's almost impossible to handle. So this study focuses on years 1 to 5 only, okay? But nevertheless, there are 5 different years to be considered. The second question is there a relationship between L1 literacy and L2 English reading performance in primary school? And as Rukmini has just given you some examples, L1 is very problematic to define. And so that is not the main focus of this study because there are so many variables to take into account. Given the wide age range of students within each school year, does age have a significant impact on L2 English reading performance within grades in primary school? And when I first read this, I was very puzzled by it. But I now know, and I now realize, that in fact, for a multitude of reasons to which there are probably an even larger multitude of answers, the students, there can be students of several different ages within the same grade. Okay, so when we're talking about the range of students within each school year, we're talking about maybe having 8-year-olds and 10-year-olds and 12-year-olds all in the same grade. And we're interested in whether age has an effect. So, as you can see, 2007, mean rank 39,955, 2009, 39,998, 2012, 38,365. You don't really need to be a highly qualified statistician to look at those figures and know that the 2012 is lower. And in fact, statistics show that it is significantly lower. There are a number of reasons why this could be explained. It could be, well, of course, given the vast numbers of students that took part, it's quite easy to get statistical significance with very little difference at all. Jamie and I argue slightly about this, but I think we do agree that there could be a number of different reasons, and if you would like him to address that, then please feel free to ask him when we have the panel discussion, because since he wrote it and he's sitting right there, I'm not actually going to go into it in great detail. If you look at the correlation coefficients for each of the grades, they are all significant and positive, which suggests that there's a strong relationship, but I would say caution is due to the design of the instruments because they were not designed for this purpose, and so retrospective analysis is always, well, often interesting, but it is always has to be taken not with a pinch of salt, but it has to be considered very carefully because it was not designed for that purpose in the first place. And so artificial constructs can creep in. So let's go back to the impact of age on L2 English reading performance. You can see if we take the 3 largest numbers of ages in each of the grades, this one is slightly problematic because 4,000 and 3,000 are very close to each other, but for all of the other years you can see that the older the learner, the higher the likelihood was that they demonstrate a higher level of performance. It's perhaps not really surprising. So on the basis of that, we suggest that there are 3 main categories of recommendations to be considered, and they really are, I have to emphasize, only recommendations. They're that the first one is that they're probably data-related, i.e. the structure of the data that emerges from the collection instrument can alter depending on how, not how it's administered, but for a number of different reasons, probably to do with, well, it is to do with administration, actually. It's probably to do with the people who administer the instrument. And the amount of support they give to the children. I mean, I know from the most famous English language test in the world, the IELTS test, there's an interlocutor frame where the person interviewing is supposed to stick absolutely to the letter of the words so that every candidate gets exactly the same opportunity to display their proficiency. And I know for a fact, because I have listened to the recordings, that the interlocutors take this very seriously. However, I also know from having observed them, when they're not being recorded for the cameras, that you get a lot of that goes on. So there could be artifacts of the collection instrument, is all I'm putting to you as a thought. The type and format of the individual questions within the instrument are something that are perhaps to be looked at, as you suggested in your presentation, Rukmini, and analysis related. So the types of analysis that might be undertaken, both of existing data, new types of data that can emerge from changes made to the instruments, and suggestions that we will make in a minute of different ways in which analysis can be undertaken. An example would be, if you look at all these are different tests, okay, the 2007, 2009, 2012, do we know that they all have the same level of difficulty? Now, they're very, very carefully constructed, and it is thought that they have the same level of difficulty, but the results cannot be demonstrated that they are all equally difficult. So therefore, the lower score in 2012 may be a result of differences in difficulty levels. It may not, but it's something to think about. So, one thing that could be done would be that we could use a single scale, probably IRT or Rausch analysis, to analyze them all, and that would enable us to see whether they were equally as difficult and whether the differences were, well, I hate to use the word meaningful because they are meaningful, but whether they were an artifact of difficulty or whether they were really reflected in ability and performance. So, thank you very much for your attention, and I'd be very happy to answer questions, and so would Jamie. Thank you. Shall I?
Thank you, Dr. Rukmini and Dr. Vivien, for sharing such insightful findings. We shall now move to the feature event of today's program, an interactive panel discussion on what can we do to make a difference to English language learning outcomes in India. May I now invite the remaining panelists to join Dr. Rukmini and Dr. Vivien on stage. Ujjwal Singh, founder, CEO of the Curriculum Company. Jamie Dunlea, researcher, English and Exams, British Council. And Alison Barrett, Director, English for Education Systems, British Council, South Asia. The session will be chaired by Colin Bangay, Senior Education Advisor, Department of International Development.
Thank you. Before we start this discussion, I'd just like to set some context and frame the discussion. There is a strong canon of literature exploring English as a colonial imposition and a language of oppression, such as Ngugi wa Thiong'o's Decolonizing the Mind. However, some 65 years on from India's independence, with Midnight's children drawing their state retirement pensions, with 140 Indian multinational businesses operating in London, generating some $14.4 billion per year. With India, the world's largest democracy, an authoritative voice on the international stage in everything from international climate relations to the International Cricket Council, I think things have changed. And while offering great opportunities for stimulating debate, this isn't the topic of this conversation. So I think we need to keep that frame in mind. As Nandan Nilekani eloquently articulates in his book, Imagining India, on the chapter around language, he cites English as the language of opportunity, and that theme is both reflected in Martin's opening remarks and in this publication. So much so that in the area that I work, which is in development, access to English language instruction is cited as one of the major drivers for the migration of Indian children from government schools to low-fee private schools. And in that context, it could be seen as an issue of social equity or social exclusion. It's therefore crucially important that we recognise the role of English within the broader call of quality education and meaningful learning for all. And with this in mind, this discussion should focus on the needs of current and future generations of Indian students. And I would respectfully request that the questions directly relate to the organiser's set theme, which is written on the board there. What can we do to make a difference to English language learning outcomes in India? Having said this, my task is to give the audience now as much space as possible to discuss this. In doing this, I would request your cooperation in complying to the following guidelines. Please distill your thoughts into one single question in order to allow time for others to ask theirs. In respect of others, please refrain from long observations covering your personal perspectives. The panellists will be available for discussion after the events, for longer in-depth discussions. And finally, please, when stating your questions, state your own name, and if you have a specific person on the panel that you wish to address the question to, please make that clear as well. With that, I have some opening questions that have been collected from you. So if I can start with Rukmini, what can be done for language learning in India, and in particular, how do you think English learning can be improved?
So we were supposed to answer these questions in 1 minute. So I will make a brave attempt. I think the only way to answer it is with a small story. It'll be a 1-minute story. This past summer, some colleagues and I, we were running a summer camp close to a village in Rajasthan. And we were 4 of us, and we were different subjects. I was doing, these were children who were in 6th standard and upwards. And we had 4 subjects running at the same time: Hindi, English, math, and science. And every night we met to discuss how things were going. And I found that every day my English colleague and I had exactly the same problems. And I was having difficulty in helping kids write their thoughts coherently, and she was having similar problems. And I think that it was kind of, we talked to each other for a couple of days without realizing that we were actually saying the same things. And when we did realize, we then began to kind of coordinate what I was doing with what she was doing, and vice versa. And led, even within a week, to a remarkable change, that once we worked on children's comprehension and expression and communication, it almost didn't seem to matter whether it was in English or in Hindi. They seemed to do both much better. So my half-a-minute remark to this would be, that I think we need to think of English as a broad continuum in which all these different languages play a role. And we have quite a long way to go in enabling children to be able to express themselves and to communicate and to understand no matter what language it is in.
Thank you. Ujjwal, you're involved in ICT and education. The question that has come for you is, can technology help in improving language learning for students across the social, economic and geographic spectrum?
Colin, I think T for technology and T for teacher. So first time when technology comes, the first fear is that, is it going to replace the teacher? No, we are talking about a technology which is an enabler in the teaching and learning process. India being a vast country and teaching is not the most preferred profession, I think technology is the only way where you can create a ubiquitous access of knowledge across the country. I'll tell you a small incident recently. When I talk about technology, we largely work on tablet-based content, and I call it a personalized learning device because it creates self-learning. We gave a full year syllabus, a 15-chapter book to students, 50 students inside a classroom, and 3 days they have gone through the whole book. So I asked them, did you read this book? Because it's digital content. They said, no, this whole book is full of animations. We have gone through all the animations. We know all the stories. You can ask any question. So my pet remark is, no child wants to learn what we want to teach them. But what they want to learn, if we can teach them their way. So all of them want to, use to see cartoon and all those stuff. If somehow we can change the process of learning in their way, we will not have to force them to say, please study, please study. And I think technology can bring that scale access around the country.
Thank you. Jamie, the question for you is, what are the practical teaching and learning implications of the relationship between mother tongue or L1 competency and second language L2 acquisition shown in your report?
Okay. Is this mic on? The short answer is I agree with everything Rukmini said, but I can give you a slightly longer answer, but it does revolve around some of the same themes. The first point I think we need to stress again and again, and it's in the report, are the caveats that we attach to our conclusions. The data was not designed to elicit an answer to this question, and it was very much, we approached it from the basis of doing a pilot study to see what kind of statistical procedures we could use in the future to tease out these relationships more clearly. What we did find this time has really just replicated what is in the literature around the world, that there is a relationship between L1 literacy and your performance in a second language. In this case, we've restricted it very clearly to performance in English reading because the tool is designed to elicit reading skills. But the relationship seems to be fairly clear, and it seems to be a positive one, that the better your reading skills in your native, well, L1 being very problematic in this context, but in the school, the language of schooling, which the children are tested in, the better their performance in the L2 reading test. That may be associated with a general academic proficiency construct. But what I personally feel is it points to something which Rukmini did indicate, and is also something which is very commonly discussed now in relation to the Common European Framework. The Common European Framework is a framework for assessing and measuring and evaluating language abilities, and gives you a framework for comparing results on tests and evaluations across contexts. Originated in Europe but has now travelled around many countries, and I've used it in Japan extensively. And part of that framework says plurilingualism, that people's linguistic abilities are not separate and tacked on to each other. They build on the human being. And the more you learn in one language, that builds your knowledge of your own L1 as well. And obviously the L1 is something in which if you're a proficient, you can access knowledge of the world. And the more knowledge of the world you have, the more you'll be able to deal with and conceptualize and think of things in the second language. So conceptually, the relationship is logically, I think, quite clear. Our data seems to indicate that yes, in this context, just as in other contexts around the world, there is a relationship which indicates that they can help each other. They shouldn't be seen to compete.
Thank you. Alison, you have a question, but it could be a PhD thesis. What needs to be done to enable teacher education to better contribute to improving English language learning outcomes in India?
Okay, I'm not going to do a PhD thesis now. I think it's a really important question, though, and one that we're being asked more and more at the British Council, and the focus on quality of teaching is equally important for us to focus on the quality of teacher education. One of the first things I think we need to think about is, does the teacher really understand what a learning outcome is? And if they understand the concept, do they know what those learning outcomes are? And therefore, how can we link the teacher training that we're doing to improving the teacher's understanding of what outcomes are, how they can address them in the classroom, what the problem areas are for their students, and ensure that the teacher education programs are need-based and relevant to them and their learners, and not relevant just to them as teachers. I think that's really crucial. And the second quick point I want to make is around the challenge with English language teaching of the teacher's own language proficiency. And if a teacher's own language proficiency is very low, then it's going to be incredibly difficult for them to improve the language learning outcomes of their students.
Thank you. Vivien, your question is, how can assessment literacy for teachers contribute to raising learning outcomes in English in India? Maybe you could start that by explaining, particularly for me, what assessment literacy for teachers actually is. I'm showing my ignorance.
Don't worry, it's the sort of buzzword of the, buzz phrase of the year. Well, actually, for the last 5 years. Jamie, can I trouble you to get me some water, please? Sorry. Basically, without getting too technical about it, because a lot of people, as soon as they hear the words assessment or testing, and I know this from, thank you very much, excuse me. I know this from the students that I've taught on the British Council Continuing Professional Development course in assessment, and I hope maybe possibly one of them is here tonight. They shy away in horror at the idea that assessment is all about statistics, and they're terrified of statistics, and that is not what we mean by assessment literacy. Of course, at certain levels, you need to use statistics. You need to show that your test is reliable and valid and all the words that you will associate with assessment. However, there are numerous other meanings to assessment literacy. And if you think about it, it's probably one of the most important areas in teacher education, and it's the one that's least touched on. Whoever teaches teachers how to create learning environments where the students can self-assess and peer assess? How do they learn how to give feedback that is meaningful and creates learning? So without going into a PhD thesis, and that was not my PhD thesis, I would say that the more teachers in India, and because I know nothing about India, but I can't see why it would be different for India, teachers all over the world, the more they know about assessment and the principles of assessment and how to do it properly, then I can see that the only way forward is for positive learning outcomes for their students.
Can I add a point there, Colin, from the Indian context? Please. In that with the introduction of CCE, comprehensive continuous evaluation, I always get the two C's mixed up. It is extremely important for teachers in India to have that knowledge of how to assess the progress and the outcomes of their students. So I think it's a really relevant point to make for India as well.
Okay. With that, I'm going to hand over to Michael, who will have collected, you've all kindly written some questions, he's collected those, and he's going to ask a selection of those to the panel.
Okay, our first question is from Professor Rama Matthew from Delhi University, who I can see actually, that's good. If you can't remember your question, I have.
As brief as possible. Yeah, it is on teacher education for language teaching actually, not about assessment directly. How can we enable teachers at the primary level to exploit the mother tongue as a pedagogical resource rather than as an act of incompetence? Should I read it again? I think teachers use a lot of mother tongue at the primary level in our country. It's usually because they do not have enough English, but it should be exploited as a pedagogical resource. So how do we enable this to happen? How do we enable teachers to be able to do this?
Maybe Alison has a question.
Yeah, I can start with that. I don't know if I have all the answers, Rama, but I think it's a huge challenge, and I think we struggle with this with the teachers we work with, because there is this assumption that if you're teaching English, you have to be speaking English all the time, and yet a lot of the teachers don't speak English at all, and so they tend to use their local language all the time. So it tends to be a sort of either-or situation, and so it's really difficult to help teachers understand when to use the local language judiciously, when it actually aids learning, and how you can actually encourage students to interact with each other, when it's appropriate for them to focus on using English and when it's appropriate for them to use the vernacular. I suppose one simple way that we look at is a teacher using the local language when they're giving rubrics and helping to give instructions and setting up tasks, and then the content of the actual task, which hopefully would be meaningful and interactive, would be in English. It's a huge challenge, I think, multilingual pedagogy. I don't think many people fully understand it. It's certainly something maybe if Professor Mahanti is in the room, maybe can tell us a little bit about in a moment. But what it's not about is translation, and it's about using the two languages judiciously in... Sorry, yes.
So if other members of the panel, and then we'll move to the next question.
Sure.
Vivien, you have some...
Yeah,
of course.
I would like to add something, because having said that I don't know anything about India, I have lived for 15 years in not a similar context, but a context of English medium education in Hong Kong. And although it's often believed that everybody in Hong Kong speaks perfect English, I can tell you that that is very, very far from the truth. And what they have in Hong Kong is it not on? Oh.
I think they want to use this.
Okay. Okay. What you have in Hong Kong is English medium education from a very, very early age. Teachers are probably quite proficient at English, maybe more than I've heard here, but the children are not. And I think what I would like to emphasize is that there is nothing wrong with using the child's own language. And in Hong Kong that's quite problematic now, because there are a number of different Chinese dialects, and you can have 10 or 12 different dialects within the same class. But nevertheless, I think what I would like to emphasize is that the teachers should stress the commensurability of both the child's vernacular language and the English language, and one does not have higher status than the other, and that has always been a problem. I don't know if it's a problem in India, but it certainly is in Hong Kong. And English is not more important. It does not have higher status. It is just another language. And I think it's very important that it should be stressed by teachers and parents that the home language, whatever the dialect might be, is as important.
Jamie, do you...
Two quick points. One might be a very practical suggestion, is to get the two very competent researchers, young researchers who accompanied us today on the survey, to demonstrate how to do it, because they were very, very skilled at using the children's language, Hindi, to facilitate the use of English and interaction with us in English, and it was a lot of fun. That might be one thing. The other, I think, sort of more far-reaching suggestion is that subjects need to be integrated more. And it's particularly easy to do in one way, more difficult in another, for primary school teachers who often teach across subjects. When things are integrated, you're dealing with the same content area, you're dealing with it not only in English and, say, their Hindi classes, you're also dealing with it in social studies or science. The concepts can be introduced and discussed and supported in the home language, and then simpler tasks can be constructed around those same ideas in the English class. And that's another example of how the languages can help each other and build on the knowledge that students have in their home language. Why deny it? Build on it. You know, it's a resource, it's a valuable resource.
Michael, could we have the next question?
Okay, our next question is Kay Ahmed, a lecturer in English in the Directorate of Education.
There's another mic.
Yeah, there's another mic coming. Sorry.
Hello. Yeah. Yeah, I think you have already answered my question. What is the role of other teachers, other than English teachers, teachers of English, in acquisition of English as a second language in India? I think you have partly answered this question earlier.
I'll just simply add to that, to emphasize that. But that's a really long... It's a fairly far-reaching and in some ways long-term curriculum development issue that the curriculum has to be integrated. And but yes, bringing other content teachers into the discussion and working together is definitely the way that you value everyone's knowledge and resources and you build on it in different classes.
Michael, can we have the next question?
As you know, this is being webcast and we have a number of interesting questions from our web viewers. There is a question from NASSCOM Social Innovation Honors, and the question, I guess, is for you, Ujjwal. Can ICT actually improve language learning outcomes?
Thanks, Dimanjan. I think I'd like to share some interesting data. Why English is so important for India at this point in time. As of 31st of December, and I know why NASSCOM is asking this, as of 31st of December, India has 200 million users over the net. And luckily or unluckily, exactly the same number is estimated to know English in India. So the whole internet world is very worried that how do we grow? Because the internet world doesn't know multilingual access. At this point of time, you will not have Hindi keyboards or computers in Hindi. So the whole world is looking at that until unless we have English as a language which is so-called an international and an internet world language, more and more people are coming soon. The growth of internet in India is going to stop. As far as ICT is concerned, it's not only new, it's for last 10 years we have seen children are very intuitive users of technology. All of you would have seen, give them an iPad, give them a phone, they will know about the whole gadget much faster and better than any of us. And I'm talking about a 3-year, 5-year-old. There's no language required. Reason being is that display which attracts them. And I'll come back to the same point which I shared in the beginning, that that's the only way scalable access of knowledge can be done. In an idealistic world, you can have very good teachers in some places. But in a realistic world, go to villages, you will not see a teacher. You would have seen a lot of videos on YouTube across Bihar or Western UP or different parts of the country. Teachers are not able to speak English themselves. And they'll finally make a mess of it by teaching them wrong English. Once you have a canned video and the recorded stuff, I'm not saying a world full of internet because I don't think that's going to happen soon in India, but you have a tablet or a phone, in that there's a video enabled education available, and we are doing that across the country in different places, and we see fantastic results. I'm sorry to take some time, but I run an underprivileged school in Eastern UP. There's a place called Balia, 60 kilometers inside Varanasi. I go every year, I carry a whole lot of gadgets with me, and I finish the whole syllabus of science, math, making the whole school as English school, so interdisciplinary, in 15 days. And it's so easy, but it's so difficult without me thinking of, without technology, I can do that. So I have a friend across US, UK, I'll call them over the net, they will roam around, they will show the world, and I'll teach geography like that. So I think that's the only way we can take English as a language, fastest way to the most deprived areas in this country.
I suspect there may be some questions on the 15 days thing. That would be interesting. Michael.
Okay, our next question is from Shika Bhatnagar, who is an independent consultant.
Hello. My question was, thank you. It was really about sort of the gender lens of the study and how the outcomes differed for girls versus boys. And I understand that there weren't concrete recommendations for policymakers, but given your expertise, how can policymakers and stakeholders ensure equal outcomes for girls as well?
Rukmini, maybe you would like to start on that and then pass it.
I mean, I can't tell you specifically about the English results, but we find in ASER generally not much gender difference in learning. There may be still some gender differences. Enrollment is very high across the board. There are some differences in some states about who goes to private schools and who goes to government schools. But we don't see very major or any significant gender differences in learning. And we'll have to look at the English ones more clearly to see if there is any English-specific, investments that families make in children that leads to better outcomes or not. But
that was certainly one of the questions we wanted to address through this study, and perhaps we will in the next one.
Yeah, should I just clarify there too that within our actual analysis, we did not treat that as a variable for this particular analysis. We were looking at a more broader range of issues, simply once again to try and tease out methods of analysis that will be useful to do these things in more detail in the future. But we did not address that issue in the main paper that's in the study.
But I do have a gender story, if I can get back to Rama's question. Am I allowed to do it?
Please.
So when she asked the question, this reminded me, I was in a teacher training session in Bihar, and one of the elderly teachers got up and said, this English is a very difficult language, but the gods are trying to master it right now. So everybody wanted to know which god, is trying to learn English these days. And he said, Lord Shiva and Parvati, for some reason, got into a competition. And Parvati was learning English much faster than Shivji. And Shivji was very worried because it's not okay, whether in heaven or on earth, to really let your wife go that far ahead. And so he needed an accelerated English learning course. And this elderly teacher then said the best way to learn English, and English grammar is very difficult. You have to memorize it, but we are good at memorizing. And he had this whole Bhojpuri song with English grammar in it, which was fantastic. I mean, I can't sing it for you, but if you knew the song, you would never have a problem with grammar again. And this was a secret tool to help the lagging behind Lord Shiva accelerate past Parvati.
From Twitter or the audience?
We've got a next question from Shalander Sharma, who's ADB Education.
Yeah. Hi. My question could be answered maybe by Rukmini or Alison. Yeah. Am I audible there?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, this is regarding the acute shortage of English teachers in most of our Hindi-speaking states like Uttar Pradesh, Bihar, Madhya Pradesh, and Rajasthan, which covers about 40% of the country. And these states, we do not really have English-trained teachers. How do you see we can, in the existing teachers lot, we can train more and more English teachers, number one. Second, what do you see and expect government policies to be, tweaked a little to welcome this aspect of teaching English in schools, because some of the state governments are also very reluctant in introducing English at primary level in various states. So how do you see that as a problem, and how do we address that?
I see this slightly differently. I think we need to define, and I think Madhav mentioned this earlier, what do we want the children to learn, and therefore what do we want teachers. If we start with what teachers know and what children know, we might move much faster. And I think, for example, that actually in terms of at least commonly used vocabulary in Hindi, there is a lot of English words. If we start from there and then build from that, rather than starting from a very unreasonable curriculum and expecting to transact that, I think we would move much faster. If you look at what the ASER tool is really not even perhaps what you expect out of children in first or second standard. And we can see that children all the way up to 8th are struggling with it. Clearly there's nothing wrong with Indian children. There may be things wrong with Indian adults in designing curriculums of this type. And therefore, if we start with, because at least for English, the enthusiasm for English is so high that we are not really capitalizing on, we often have in ASER all sorts of funny incidents around English. I had an incident of an old lady. She must have been at least 70. She was very keen that this English tool, and luckily it's only one piece of paper, we should leave it behind for her. And she said, you come back next year and I'll know it. So, there is a great deal of desire to learn. People already know quite a bit. And how to move from there to getting to where we want to go may be a much better strategy than starting with some unreasonable level of curriculum.
Maybe, Alison, you could add Bihar, TESS India, other initiatives you're aware of.
Can you hear me? I think my microphone has gone off, hasn't it? Thanks. I can't see anymore. Just to quickly follow up on that before addressing Colin's point, I think there's a lot of anxiety around when to introduce English. And if you introduce English at grade 1, half an hour, 20 minutes a day, but it's in Hindi and the teacher can't teach very well in English, and you're not necessarily going to actually make that much impact. So what's more important, I think, is to decide to introduce English at a time when you know that the quality of that provision can actually make an impact and can provide educational outcomes that are meaningful. So that would be my first point. I think that this ties into a little story I want to tell you about, actually a Bangladeshi researcher that I met last week in London, who's researching a topic that he calls language shock, based on the term culture shock. And I think he coined the phrase, but I'm not sure. But what he's researching the shock that learners get when they go through 13, 14 years of schooling, having studied English for half an hour a day or whatever it might have been, and then they get to higher education and they need to study in English medium and they can't speak English. And they're like, what? Well, I've just studied English for 14 years. How come I can't speak it, or how come I can't operate in English? And he's studying the impact that that has on an individual's self-esteem and their confidence and their personality. So isn't it better to start teaching English at higher quality a little later, when you know that it can actually perhaps avoid that shock and help the student get where they need to go? So that would be my first point. So secondly, the question you asked about teacher shortage, I think that's a huge issue facing many countries that the British Council is operating in. One of the ways that we're trying to address that through an innovative technological program in Uruguay, where we're actually teaching learners directly from the Philippines and teaching them English directly into their classrooms through video conferencing technology. So that way I think technology is actually enhancing the learning experience and at the same time building the capacity of the teachers as they go along. So that's one way. And perhaps with the video conferencing technology available in India, you could have the 100,000 extra out of work teachers in Maharashtra teaching the students in Bihar, maybe. I mean, just an idea. So another way, through some very innovative partnerships, the Open University is working in partnership with MHRD in India on a project called TESS India, and I believe Danny is here. I saw him earlier. But if you're interested in TESS, I can introduce you to them later. And that is providing access to high quality learning and teaching materials and teacher education materials for teachers of all subjects, so they can actually enhance their skills, but also work with groups of teacher educators who can help mediate their language improvement or their methodological improvement. So I think there are lots of different innovative things happening out there, and it's about finding the channel that you think will help.
Just to
build on that discussion of teachers and the lack of teachers with the competence to teach English. I think this is, once again, it's nice to reach out and sort of across context. And I've, until very recently, been working in Japan, and we see very similar issues, very different contexts, but very similar issues arise. And one of the causes of that is that English is, the age at which people are being asked to learn English is being constantly dropped lower and lower, to the point where you get a lot of teachers who never expected to have to teach English suddenly being required to do so. So it's not unexpected or unreasonable for them to be rather nervous about it. And we do, you know, there's not enough support generally there to bring these people up to a level where they would feel confident. So it's very important in these contexts not to demonize the teachers either. Teachers are a convenient whipping stock in many countries, and I think we need to be very careful to value the teachers and to help them feel confident and build with them, and not to just blame them for the problem.
Okay, I think in addition to that, Michael and Debanjan here, the Council is doing a whole raft of work in teacher education. Michael runs a very important project in secondary education, English language in Bihar. After the event, he's a great person to talk to, Debanjan also. With that, I'd like to, we've got about 10 minutes left. I'd like now to open the floor, open the questions to the floor for spontaneous questions. So if anybody from the floor would like to either ask the question they've already set or a new question in response to things that have been said, then please make yourself known to the mic men.
Thank you, sir. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. As many people, as many accents we hear around us. My question is, how to attain and achieve the uniformity in English language, in particular the neutral accent. People are confused about US and UK accent. They are always confused of which accent we should stick to. Although it's not much of a difference. It hardly makes any difference.
I'll give this on now. I'll just say one very quick answer. Don't.
I was going to say something similar, but slightly longer version. Just to
don't.
Okay.
Rukmini wants to say something.
Sorry. My grandmother, who was in her 90s, used to say that the only, and she's a Bengali speaker, she said the only person whose English she can understand is Pranab Mukherjee.
Sorry, Alison.
I'm going to grab my mic. My question would be, we have a project where we're working in Bihar with the Rajyamak Shiksha Abhiyan, and we're teaching secondary school students from all across the state of Bihar, absolutely every district, and this is a project that Michael can tell you about. And what kind of accent do you think those students need to communicate with each other? And it's not my accent. It's not a neutral accent. They need to learn what they need for their situation.
Okay, next question. Oh, sorry. Yeah, sorry.
Okay.
Yeah.
There is a whole range of variations in how English is both acquired and learned in India. If at all it is acquired in the urban upper class homes, it's acquired more through deliberate teaching, subtle deliberate teaching, focused on primarily cognitive academic domains, whereas the inner lifestyle, the core values, they are all the affective domain, they are all left to regional languages. The second variation is in the nature of schools, what I have called from Doon schools to Doom schools in India, where you have a whole range of how English is learned in those situations. So all said and done, how do you really talk of a English teaching pedagogy or the English teaching methodology in that kind of range of situations? Do you talk of ESL? Do you talk of EFL? Because there is a range actually. So we need to really address that question as to how should English be taught given that range of variation in India.
I think you're absolutely right, and this is a discussion we've been having with the Vice Chancellor of the English and Foreign Languages University, that India and I think many other countries in South Asia provide a really interesting a challenge and a context in that you have EFL, ESL, third language, fourth language, all in one classroom with one teacher who may not even speak any of those languages, or may speak one common language, or maybe, varying levels of competence in several. So it is a massive challenge, and I think it's an area that we're all committed to researching further, to understanding how we can help primary school teachers particularly work together to try and ensure that that language acquisition works across subjects. I mean, what we find in our projects is that we're working very closely with teachers who teach English. They're usually the best primary English language speaker in the primary school. They may not have been trained to be an English teacher, but we find that other teachers crowd at the door and watch them when they're teaching their lessons, and they actually start thinking, what are they doing? Maybe I could try that in my class. Maybe I could teach Hindi in this way. So one way I think that we're trying to encourage it through our programs is that spirit of collaboration within the school itself, and helping the teachers to share the learnings that they're gaining from their experience, and to integrate, as Jamie was saying earlier. But it is a huge challenge and an area, I think, of further research as well.
Any further? No? Sorry, there was a lady. Yeah.
Yes, I was. My question is. I mean, it isn't exactly related to what you have said so far, but then there seems to be a big gap between, say, speaking the language and knowing the language. What happens, I think, in our country and possibly in other parts of the world, that people understand some English when they read it, when they hear it, but then they're not able to, get the sounds out of their own, mouth, so to say, to roll the words out of the tongue. So I was wondering, I mean, considering we are amongst experts, what is it? Is it a psychological problem? Is it, there seems to be this, because years of, they understand everything that you're saying. They might write, their vocabulary, like some of you have pointed out, the vocabulary is pretty rich. And sometimes they may not have access to very simple words, but yet they are able to use certain phrases. So there is this kind of a jumbled, holistic, something that they know in English, they know as English, they are able to understand it, but they're not able to speak it. And however hard the teacher may try, it doesn't happen within the formal, the kind of time that we have within the formal system. So I was wondering if, there could be some input into that.
Thoughts on
from the panel.
communicative English?
I think one thing I would, once again, just to speak rather less from the data and from some personal experiences, the children we met today had lots of words coming out of their mouths, and literally it was very, very inspiring to see their interest and attempts to communicate. And these were by no means privileged children who had access to a private education. So I think it speaks to a certain degree to what Rukmini was speaking about before. It's expectations, and often there is a big gap between expectations and realizable practical goals, and also useful goals. And then that also links to the question which I answered rather briefly, to the gentleman, about standardizing. I think there is no one-size-fits-all in terms of the goals or the approaches to reaching them. And we have to be flexible, and we have to recognize that there will be people who will want to attain different levels. And we have to have an education system which is able to sort of flexibly deal with those and the different goals that are appropriate for different people. But then again, I would also reiterate once again across different contexts, the issues that you raise I hear commonly in many different countries, particularly in EFL contexts where people don't have a chance to express themselves at a daily level. So the issues are not really unique, but in many ways I think it is a gap between unrealistic expectations and setting realistic goals.
Okay. Yes? Yeah.
When we go to schools, the first thing you see around the corridors says, "Keep quiet." It's all about giving me a cycle and say, "Don't cycle." But you have to learn cycling. So I think the first change should happen inside the classroom, saying that
teachers should not speak more than 40% and let the children speak 60%. Second big thing is about input versus output. If the teacher himself or herself is not speaking or speaking wrong, then the output also will like to remain the same. But I think the first one is a bigger challenge. The teachers love to speak so much, they don't allow children to speak, and usually they keep quiet thing. I first go to the principal and request, can you just remove this?
On that note, with people, I think...
there's a very interesting question on Twitter.
Okay, I'm just worried about time, so this has to be the last one before we let the panel sum up. But in the sake of ICT showing the way forward, please.
Yes. Thanks, Colin. This question is from Sojo Varuges. Are there any visible regional differences in terms of children's ability to read English according to ASER, and why?
Very interesting question.
Again, I haven't prepared well enough, but there are. We see certain parts of India are doing better. We have 2 states which are English. I'm looking at my colleagues in the audience. They have 2 states which have English language instruction, Nagaland and Kashmir. I think the performance in those states is somewhat better. In this politically charged climate, I don't want to say anything too problematic, but in Gujarat it is a bit lower. And that's partly because I think Gujarat results are actually quite interesting, because Gujarat is one of the states that introduces English quite late. I think it's in 4th or 5th standard that they introduce English. But that doesn't mean that the children don't know any English. I think we sometimes, at least I feel, we overestimate the influence of teachers and schools. There's a lot that kids are learning from everywhere. And therefore, so you would expect in Gujarat children before 4th not to know any English. That's not the case. They, at least on our tool, that they know quite a lot. And I think that one of the things that we are hoping that British Council will help us do is to really look, our sample sizes are fairly large by state. And when there are many variables, there are all sorts of things about home language. There are many different home languages. There are differences about scripts. There are places in India where you use Roman script even in your home language. And then there are other scripts, and there when is English introduced. And I think that given that there is so much hullabaloo about English and on both sides, we really haven't done much empirical work to look at, kids actually know quite a bit and what influences that. And for states where the kids seem to know more, what influences those. So we are looking forward to a meeting tomorrow with several people on the stage who will then produce a series of reports to which you will be invited over and over again for such meetings.
Not in 3 weeks. Great. Before we sum up, any other comments on that point? Okay, then can I give 2 minutes to each panelist just to sum up before we hand over the floor? Right. So Vivien.
To sum up, I would say, it's not on, is it? It is. Oh. Give the teachers more tools, more armory to teach with. And by that I would say give them more information about assessment, help them to devise assessments for learning rather than to rank order or to tell outside agencies how well kids are doing. Actually give them the tools to help the kids to learn more. And for that, you need to put that into their initial teacher training, which I think is sadly missing at the moment. And I would just like to say, and I bet Martin doesn't know this, the British Council has a huge, huge program that is just starting to bring assessment literacy. Actually, I think Barry's aim is to the entire world, but it is starting within the British Council, and anybody who works there will be able to participate in this program, but within a very, very short time it will go out free, unfortunately mostly to teachers who speak English to start with, but the innovative thing about it is that we will have a series of assessment topics that will be animated, because it seems that that is very popular, and they will be voiced over in English or in whatever local language is needed. So if you're worried about how to bring assessment literacy to teachers in parts of India that I've never even heard of, probably, just get in touch and give us a voiceover and we will be able to help you do it. Thank you.
I'd like to go back to the theme of teacher education. And one thing the data showed us from the report is that within a classroom we have children of lots of different ages. And I think it's a well-known fact that you have a wide variety in the classroom of multi-grade children. And that the older children, their learning outcomes in English and actually their first language are usually better. And one of the challenges, I think, is to help teach teachers to use the resource within their classroom in terms of the learner's skills and to employ much more effective methods of multi-grade teaching than they do currently. My observations of teachers in India since I've been here over the last, I won't tell you how many years, but a long time, teachers tend to teach half the class one activity for 10 minutes while the others remain silent, and then they'll turn over and they'll teach the others. So research shows that if you can actually group students by ability, Rukmini can tell you all about that, or if you group them by age, or group them with an older child, with a group of younger children, or you bring in elements of peer learning, peer coaching, that can actually be much more effective than that sort of approach of treating your class as two separate classes within one room. And I think that's really crucial as well.
I think the first thing I'd really like to take the chance to do is give due credit to my co-author of the paper, Karen Dunn, who did the majority of very complex statistical analyses, which was really our intention for this paper, to try and see what kind of innovative ways we could apply statistical analysis techniques to learn more about the data we already have and to build on it. So I think Karen deserves a great deal of credit for anything that comes out of the report. And then just to once again reiterate that the report is not meant to be conclusive. It's meant to be a starting point and say, well, we can use these techniques and go further and actually learn more about these in more detail. So we wouldn't like it to be taken out of context in that respect. And just then to perhaps reiterate or summarize a few key words that I think have come out of this for me. And one of them is empowering the teachers and empowering the learners, giving them more respect for their own background and their own language, but also giving them the tools and the space, particularly the learners. We're talking about communicative ability, the space to actually interact and express themselves. So empowering is very important and seems to be something that's very consistently taken into consideration by all of the programs that we've heard about today. And that's also something that I learned very much today by attending the project. I was almost inclined after attending that demonstration today to put the whole report aside and say, it doesn't really matter. What's happening is just so good. Impact. Impact is another buzzword in language testing around the world, and this was a classic case of very positive impact. The amount of interest that was generated amongst both the learners and their parents and their community, and to bring them and involve them in the whole learning process and the consideration of the policies around their learning process. It seems to me to have very positive impact as it is, but of course we can look to ways we can work together to perhaps make that impact even more solid in the future.
I don't know, give and take who is counting, but India has approximately 15 million teachers today. Whether we'd like it or not, we'll have to make them a super teachers, because existing teaching pedagogy is not helping us too much. One more way ICT can help, and I'm holding the fort for ICT today, one more way ICT can help is, imagine in a rural India, a teacher is carrying a laptop or a tablet going back home. This is an aspiration in the society. Gives a lot of respect in our own house, in the neighborhood, and if there's an aspiration to be teachers in due course of time, then I think we'll solve a big challenge that a lot of better people around the society will start coming and seeing. So we have done this and seen that teachers who carry back home a laptop or a tablet is much more respected in our own house first.
Thank you. Rukmini.
I think just two things from ASER that we have learned. One is that we also ask whether there's any reading material in the house of any kind, from religious books to newspapers or anything other than textbooks. And our report year on year shows us that less than 20% of households have anything to read. And so I think that one of the things that we feel very strongly is that whether it's in school or outside school, and probably even more outside school, we need to have really a print-rich environment, no matter what language it is in. The second thing is that I'm sure Jamie and Vivien felt this today, that the simplicity of the ASER tool, is good for assessment, but also it's something to read. And so the lack of easy, simple things, whether in Hindi or in any language or in English, that is out there. I mean, everything seems to start at a slightly higher level. We need to flood our environment with things which are easy to read that will encourage both adults and children. I think cell phone companies, newspapers, all the non-traditional people who produce text and print in this country have to be brought into this to say, if you want to help learning to improve in India, I mean, India has to help. Just the 15 million teachers can't do it alone.
Thank you. I think that was a very stimulating set of questions and great responses from a panel that really is dedicated to making a difference. I'd like to thank them all for that. Thank you for your collaboration around answering the question that was set, the exam question that was set. And with that, I'll hand over to the MC.
Thank you, Colin. Can you just speak?
Thanks very much. Thank you.
At the registration desk and also collect a copy of the report. Please may I now invite Baroness Usha Prashar, our Deputy Chair, to give the vote of thanks.
Thank you very much indeed. Well, this is the second ceremonial role. Mansi, can I say how much I enjoyed your joke about Shivaji and Parvati ji? Because as they said, there's no end to man's ingenuity when it comes to competing with women. But having said that, I think you'll all agree with me that this has been a very, very rich discussion. Because as someone who has been personally involved in literacy issues in the UK, and in the very early 70s, when we were looking at bilingualism among the migrant community in the UK, I was in some ways reliving some of the issues raised. And I think the two things I'd like to pick out is again what Rukmini said, that we really got to need to understand how children learn. They learn in different contexts, and I think we've got to be very much aware of that. The second thing is that bilingualism or multilingualism, the conceptual development in your own mother tongue is just as important as it is in another language. And I think what I found that this particular collaboration has enabled a very deep understanding. And as much as it has enlightened us, I think it raises further questions. And obviously this is a start, not the end of the process. I mean, apart from looking at, you know, what the outcomes are, how children learn, the context within which they learn. Again, I think it's important to think how we develop strategies which actually are going to make sure that this becomes a reality. And I think in that sense, you'll agree with me, not because I'm Deputy Chairman of the British Council, that how the British Council is an enabler in terms of bringing people together. And I think it's that cooperation which has actually enriched that. And Madam, I will say to you, you ought not to feel honored, it's we are honored. Because as you know, I have worked with Pratham in a different context. And I think it's important that we really understand not just how the middle class upper echelon children learn, but is how all children learn. Because communication is also about equity. Because if you know the language, you can communicate. I think it opens the world to you. To me, it's about social justice. So I want to really thank all the panel members, all the contributors, all the researchers, and I'm very delighted that there has been cooperation between the University of Hyderabad, Lancaster, Reading, Pratham, and the British Council to produce this work. And I'm very grateful to all of you for being here and very enriching questions that you've asked. And this is, of course, I said, not the end. There's going to be drinks outdoors so you can continue your discussion. But I know that it highlights the further work that we have to do. So thank you, and I'm very grateful that I was here in India to witness the work that's being done at this level. And it's particularly grateful for me because, as I say, it's a subject that I have been involved in and continue to be through an organization called the National Literacy Trust, which I'm involved with. So I think for me it's been equally a learning and it's reinforced some of the things that I know. So thank you very, very much indeed.